Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode in the Get Unstuck series with myself, Sarah Archer. I am a career and leadership coach, and I work with female leaders to help them move forward in their careers through either advancing and getting that next level promotion or new role, or having more impact and influence in their existing role. And I started the Get Unstuck series because I know as a leader, it's really hard to find time to think about your career aspirations and your career challenges. And so I wanted to just have 15 minutes in your week when you could tune in and get some ideas, tips, techniques, whatever it might be, to help you navigate some of those challenges and get motivated to follow those aspirations. So the sessions are always short, they're around 15 minutes, and they're always very practical. You'll come away with tips and techniques. And before we dive into today's topic, I just wanted to share some exciting news with you in that this week I am going to be launching my podcast Unstuck and Unstoppable, so that you'll be able to tune into various different topics similar to what we do in the lives and listen to them at any point that you might choose to. So more on that in the posts in LinkedIn and Facebook to give you the link once it goes live. So let's talk about today's topic. And obviously, if you've got questions or if you're here with me live, do say hi in the comments, do post your questions in the comments. And if you've got, ideas or thoughts on the topic, please post them too, because they could help somebody else who's struggling with this. So we're going to talk about how to turn your inner critic into an inner coach today. Because, while we might want to be our best cheerleader, often we are our own worst critic. And I'm guessing if you are tuning in today, if you've signed up for this session, it's because your critic is kind of getting in the way. Because, when you think about what it says to you, it'll be things like, you're not good enough, you can't do this, you're going to fail. And the impact of that can be really considerable over time. It can affect your self-esteem and obviously your career confidence. It can also affect your mental health because it can increase your anxiety and your stress. It can impact your professional relationships because you might hold yourself back from connecting with certain people. You might feel inhibited about having certain conversations. You might misinterpret conversations because of that inner chatter. And it can get in the way of you achieving both your personal and professional goals, because you can self-sabotage, you can procrastinate because of the self-doubt that is perpetuated by your inner critic. So I guess the first thing I wanted to say is I wanted to kind of normalize it in that everybody has an inner critic. So even if you think about the most confident person they will have an inner critic. But the difference is how they actually manage that critic. And that's obviously what we're going to talk about today. And that ability to manage your inner critic is kind of the root of confidence, because your inner critic impacts how you present in the world, how you show up in the world, how you interact in the world. And so if we can change that inner critic into an inner coach, that will ultimately change how you show up in the world and how you interact in the world as well. And what I would say is that, a lot of the clients that I've worked with, a lot of them senior leaders, experience this self-doubt that's perpetuated by the inner critic. And I'm going to share obviously some of the techniques that I use with them today with you. And I've also written a book called Developing Your Inner Coach, which I will put a link to. If you wanted to kind of read more about some of the techniques, you can access that through my book. But let's just try and understand, why do we have an inner critic? Why have we got this voice in our head that is saying all these really unhelpful things to us? And what we know from neuroscience is that the primary purpose of the limbic or primal brain is to keep us safe. So it's to keep us alive, essentially, alive and safe. And therefore it scans for risk. So it's constantly scanning for potential risk. And obviously, our physical risks are much lower now. And so, what it's programmed to scan for most now is emotional risks. So, situations where you might be vulnerable, situations where you might be exposed, situations that are going to potentially lead to a negative outcome for you as it perceives it. And what's important to notice here as well is that some people have a higher risk bias. We all have a risk bias, but some people will tend to have a higher negative risk bias. So that's probably useful for you to notice whether you tend to fall into that negative risk bias or higher negative risk bias. And so what the brain does then, when it's identified that potential risk situation, it will use your inner critic to get you to stop taking action. And it uses the inner critic because the inner critic is privy to all your deepest, darkest, secret fears. And therefore, it will use those fears to get you to stop taking action, to withdraw from that interview for that next role, to say no to that opportunity to do X or Y, to create enough doubt for you not to push yourself forward in whatever it might be. And it speaks from fear, which is why it's so unpleasant to have this inner critic kind of in your ear. And that's why we want to reduce the power of the inner critic and amplify the inner coach, because you do have an inner coach as well. And I want to just tell you a little bit about a client that I worked with who had a very powerful inner critic. So this is Tony, and she worked in a very senior planning role. And she had an inner critic that told her a lot of the time that the work she did wasn't good enough, that she wasn't good enough. And it spoke to her tendencies for perfectionism and that insecurity around perfectionism. And you can probably see there's lots of crossovers with the inner critic and other confidence challenges. And a lot of people in Tony's world were reliant on her piece of work to be able to get on with their piece of work. And this obviously put an enormous amount of pressure on her, particularly as her inner critic was saying, you've got to do it to this high standard, it's got to be perfect, you've got to work longer hours to get it to that standard. You're never going to be able to meet their demands, their expectations. And this was just causing her a huge amount of stress. And, she was kind of getting close to burnout. And so what we had to do was use some of the techniques that I'm going to share with you today to help her flip her narrative and to be more of an inner coach. Now, I'm going to share with you various steps that you can use to kickstart this process. But I want to caveat this in that, if you think about how long your inner critic has been vocal for, this is a 15-minute session. We're not going to be able to flip it into an inner coach in a 15-minute session. It's going to take work and energy and commitment to doing it. But what I want you to know is that it's really possible to quieten your inner critic and amplify your inner coach. So it is possible, and you can maybe just start experimenting with some of these ideas and see what emerges for you. So the first step is just to notice the voice and what it's actually saying to you, and write down what it's saying to you. Because often, because we've had our inner critic around for so long, we sort of stop noticing how horrible it is. It's just kind of constantly there. Those thoughts are kind of popping into our heads, and we're not really paying attention consciously, but obviously it's having an unconscious impact on us. So by being able to kind of write it down, we can get some perspective on it. My goodness, am I saying those things to myself? They're really unkind and horrible and not nice. And you can just start to notice also when that inner critic is most vocal. Like, is it there all the time with everything you do? Or is it triggered by certain situations that you're engaging in? Does it become louder when you're about to step out of your comfort zone, or when you're doing a particular activity or interacting with a particular person? So noticing the triggers can be really helpful, or just noticing that it's kind of constantly there. And then step 2 is recognizing that you have a choice. So you have a choice about how you choose to speak to yourself. And that's important, because that's recognizing that you have the power to change this. And also then to engage in self-compassion, because self-compassion is a superpower. Because if you look at how you tend to speak to yourself through your inner critic, it's not compassionate at all. It's really harsh and not nice. And so what we can do is to use something called perceptual positions to just step out of this being about us and look at how you're speaking to yourself and think, gosh, if my best friend was speaking to themselves like that, what would I say to them? And you wouldn't reinforce all the things your inner critic is saying to you. You know you wouldn't. You'd be saying some really encouraging, some really nurturing, some really supportive things to your best friend. So just being able to think about, okay, how would I speak to my best friend? That's how I want to speak to myself going forward. And just then we can think about being intentional, which is step 3. But before that, we also just want to acknowledge our brain's intention. So we know that our brain wants to keep us safe. And so acknowledging that that inner critic is coming from a place of fear and being afraid, by being compassionate to our inner critic rather than telling it off, is also really powerful. So just acknowledging your brain's trying to do its primary job, which is to keep you safe. And I'll just explain a bit more how that might look in a minute. So step 3 is then to be really conscious and intentional, because we want to change the dialogue. We want to change the narrative, the conversation that you have with yourself, and reframe it into more positive dialogue. So let me give you a little example of what that might be like. So I worked with a client who had a really kind of horrible burnout experience in a senior role, and it was a while ago, but she was kind of feeling she wanted to sort of re-engage with more senior roles. So she was starting to apply for jobs, but what she noticed was every time she did, her inner dialogue was really negative, and it was telling her, don't apply for those jobs. Why are you putting yourself in that position? You're going to burn out again. You're going to experience all those horrible things that happened last time. Don't do it. Stay where you are. It's safe. It's comfortable. And so she was finding it really hard to put the applications in, and the thought of an interview was just completely terrifying. So what we worked on was changing that narrative to remind herself actually that she'd changed. So the dialogue went something like this. So first of all, thank you, brain, or whatever you call your inner critic. I know you're trying to keep me safe. I know you're trying to protect me, but you don't need to worry. So you're kind of reassuring the inner critic. You don't need to worry because I'm a different person to that person who suffered burnout 3 years ago. I've got lots of strategies and techniques now to keep myself safe, to support myself, and to look after myself. Plus, this job, I've looked at the job description. It looks like it's really doable. I don't feel like it's going to be overly stressful. I've looked at the organisation. They've got a really strong wellbeing policy. And from what I know about my line manager, they seem someone that I could get on really well with and would be really supportive of me. So the narrative is just reassuring. It's really compassionate. It's really, reassuring you that actually you've got strategies, you've got strengths, that you're going to be okay. And therefore your inner critic can kind of just relax a bit, which is what we're aiming for. So we want to change that dialogue, and we can do that also by noticing from that first step, when you were writing down what's your inner critic saying, that you can just practice replacing phrases as well. So if you have thoughts about I'm not good enough, consciously going, no, I am good enough, and just replacing the phrase. So if you say to yourself, I can't do that, replacing it with, how can I do that? Or you'll never succeed. You can do this. So just listening to what you're saying and choosing to replace the thought. Now, obviously, this takes time because your negative inner critic, has been vocal for a long time. It's developed thought patterns that have become entrenched. So it has to work really hard then to put these new thoughts and embed them into your brain, into your consciousness. But like I said, it's definitely possible. So once you've done those first 3 steps, the step 4 is actually then to think about strengthening your inner coach, because she's in there, but she's not been allowed to be very vocal and say very much. So what we need to now do is think about, how can I amplify my inner coach and give her more fuel, more evidence, more information to help her become more present in my brain. And obviously thinking about the benefits of having an inner coach is really powerful as well. So obviously the benefits are the opposite to what the inner critic's impact is. So you'll have a cheerleader, an internal cheerleader, who's very encouraging, who's supportive, who wants you to do well and wants you to fulfill your potential and have stretch in your job. She'll help you overcome setbacks and reframe them. She'll be able to build your confidence and your self-belief, and she'll help you manage stress and reduce anxiety. So there's lots of benefits for your inner coach, which is really encouraging to think about. So the ways to then strengthen your inner coach are to do things like this. So one is to identify the positives that you bring and remind yourself regularly. So that's things like your strengths, your qualities, your leadership brand, your achievements, things you've done really well, things you're proud of, any feedback that you have had, and just to kind of collate this. And often with my clients, we do something called an achievement journal, where they actually start to collect evidence of things that have gone well and the skills and qualities they've used to enable that, because it's physical evidence that you can read and use to support your inner coach. Then we also want to think about using more positive self-talk. So obviously we've talked about reframing some of the phrases your inner critic might choose to use, but we can also amplify that by using intentional directional statements, also known as affirmations, which is just a positive way of reprogramming your thought pattern. So choosing a positive statement about yourself to repeat on a regular basis, and obviously continuing the work around reframing those negative thoughts. And then also choosing to engage in positivity, particularly if you've got a high negative risk bias. So looking at things like podcasts, books, lives, meditation, music, things that make you feel positive, and choosing to bring consciously more of them into your working week, so that again you're giving more fuel to your inner coach to draw on. So remember, we're not getting rid of your inner critic. She is a part of you and she serves a purpose. So we want to treat her with compassion, but what we want to do is let her relax a bit by reassuring her and using our inner coach, increasing the volume of our inner coach to actually support us more with our daily challenges of being a female leader. So just to recap for you, what we're going to do is notice what your inner critic is saying to you, write it down, get some perspective, recognize you have a choice, and start to get compassionate with yourself and with your inner critic. Be conscious and intentional, start reframing your inner narrative, and then look at and strengthening your inner coach through both capturing and reminding yourself of your strengths and achievements, using positive self-talk, and bringing more positivity into your daily working life. So I hope you found that helpful. It's given you some food for thought around your inner critic and how vocal it is, when it's vocal, and how you can start to encourage your inner coach to be more present. And obviously, if you've got any questions, or if you want to have some detailed support on this, some deep support on this, obviously do get in touch and we can have a conversation around you developing your inner coach to support you going forward in your leadership career. I will see you back here next Wednesday at 12:15 for another live in the Get Unstuck series. And watch out for my post this week about the launch of my podcast, Unstuck and Unstoppable. Have a great week.